Trev, one of the questions that comes up from Romans chapter 11 is about Israel. I mean, Paul makes some pretty specific claims about the nation, the people of Israel in the future. Like, what will that be? And so just want to have a conversation about, like, will there be does Romans chapter 11 teach that there is a future for the nation of Israel when en masse they receive salvation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it does seem to indicate that. You're preaching on it, so you've done a little bit closer study on it, especially just recently here.
Yeah.
So I would say that it seems to imply that.
Yeah.
But I'll pass that back to you.
Well, what's so fascinating in Romans chapter 11 is Paul gives this very specific and, tangible illustration of the olive tree. And you see this kind of play out in, I think, starting in verse 17, he starts talking about branches being cut off. And here's essentially what he's saying. He's like, look, you imagine that there is a tree in front of you. This whole tree, this represents the people of Israel. Well, he's saying that there are branches that are dead, represented by, unbelieving Jewish people, right? And he says that God has cut those branches off. He's set them aside, and he's taken branches from a wild olive tree, which is, in Paul's analogy, this represents the Gentiles. He's brought them in, he's grafted that, he's bound them up, grafted them into this tree so that now they are part of the tree of Israel, right? And so I think some of the question, that this kind of ties in some of the other things we've been talking about is like, how God hardened those branches. The reason they're dead branches in unbelief is because, Paul says God hardened them. He blinded them so they couldn't see. So they are, cast aside to the ground. But what's so interesting about this passage in Romans chapter 11 is it's basically Paul telling the Gentiles, look, if God did this to natural branches, why do you think he couldn't do it to you? And if he can graft you in, he can take those branches and graft them back in. I mean, that's exactly how he ends this whole section. For if you were cut from what is, by nature a wild olive tree, grafted contrary to nature into cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? And so it sounds like what he's saying is the dead branches, those who are not believing in it, will at one point be grafted back into the people of God. The other piece that's really interesting about this is, I think this ties into what you were saying, where, there's pieces of the scriptures that, like, we should expect to be surprised in the eschaton. And Paul basically asked this question a couple different ways in Romans chapter 11, some iteration of, like, look, if reconciliation was brought to the world because of Israel's unbelief, the Gentiles are grafted in, how much more will their inclusion be back in, right? Like, what will that bring about? And I think it kind of creates this anticipation for something miraculous and incredible. And the thrust of Romans chapter 11 seems to be saying that God does have a future for the nation of Israel.
And one of the interesting pieces is that you'll see other passages, right, like Mark 13 being one of them, that talks about there being wars and rumors of wars, and Jesus saying, pay attention to the signs. You'll kind of see the end of the age coming. And so that seems to lend itself more to sort of that premillennial understanding that things are going to be rough right before the end. But then you look at this, and there's a sense in which it seems like there's going to be sort of this great influx of people coming to faith. It kind of seems to indicate, Jewish and Gentile, which would almost give more of like a post-mill understanding that people are coming to faith and being transformed and ushering in the kingdom. But yet at the same time, you got the wars and rumors of wars. There are certain pieces that are like, they're just difficult to kind of figure out how these work together. The different interpretive frameworks.
Well, you bring up Mark chapter 13. This is kind of my, this is something I go back to a lot in Mark chapter 13, talking about, there's all this abomination of desolation, talking about the second coming of the Son of Man. If you carefully look for these details, one, you will see everything that Mark talks about, in some sense, actually happens by the end of Mark's gospel. Like, it happens in that time frame. And then historically, I think these things are they are shadows or types of what is supposed to happen in the true last days. So it kind of plays out on repeat. It's very fun and fascinating to dig into some of this stuff. But all that to say, I think for us as Christians, the imperative is that we live as if Jesus could return at any moment, right? Like we have this expectation that it could be, I mean, it could be tonight. It could be, moments after we stop listening to or watching this video.
Yeah. And so I guess that's part of the point of eschatology is just sort of, that it's wise to always be ready.
Always be ready. Yeah. And that seems to be the general counsel of Scripture.